The Young and the Restless Spoilers shock. The hospital corridors were suffocating that night, their white walls echoing with the sound of hurried footsteps and urgent voices. Noah Newman's room was a battlefield of beeping machines and whispered prayers. His body lay motionless beneath sterile sheets, pale and fragile, a cruel contrast to the vibrant energy that had once defined him. The crash had taken more than just his consciousness, it had shattered the illusions that his family had built their lives upon. Every passing second felt like an eternity as doctors moved with clinical precision, trying to stabilize the son of two parents who were already unraveling. Nick Newman stood near the doorway, his mind suspended between disbelief and desperation. The news had been brutal enough when the police called to say Noah's car had gone off the highway, but the horror that followed was something no father could prepare for. Severe internal bleeding, they said. Multiple transfusions required. His son was fading, and the only thing that could save him was blood, the most basic bond between parent and child. The doctor's voice was calm, professional, but Nick barely heard the words. All he understood was that time was running out. They needed compatible blood immediately. Noah's rare type left them with few options, and in that moment, the family's survival instinct took over. Sharon, trembling but composed, agreed without hesitation. "Test us both," she said. It was instinct, pure and maternal. She would have given anything, her life, her body, her last breath, if it meant saving her son. Nick nodded beside her, clutching her hand as if the contact itself could anchor him against the storm. The lab team arrived swiftly, drawing their blood, labeling the samples, and disappearing down the sterile hallway. The waiting began, 10 minutes, maybe 15, but every second felt like a century. Nick tried to keep his faith. He had always believed in his family, in love, in the power of doing what was right. But as the minutes dragged on, he noticed Sharon's demeanor shift. Her eyes darted to the floor, her breathing quickened, and when the doctor's footsteps echoed down the hall again, her entire body seemed to tighten, as though bracing for impact. Nick reached for her arm, but she stepped back ever so slightly, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. When the doctor entered the room, the energy changed. He didn't smile. He didn't offer reassurance. He carried a clipboard, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He began speaking gently, too gently, and that's when the first crack appeared in Nick's world. "There's a complication," he said. The words felt detached, clinical, almost abstract. A complication. Not with Noah's condition, not with the transfusion, but with the results. The doctor's eyes moved between Nick and Sharon, hesitating before delivering the blow. "Mr. Newman," he said carefully, "your blood type doesn't match your son's." For a moment, Nick couldn't process what he was hearing. He blinked, expecting the doctor to correct himself, to say there had been an error, a mix-up, anything. But when he looked at Sharon, the woman he had trusted, the mother of his child, her face told him everything. The color drained from her cheeks, her lips parted, and tears welled in her eyes before she even tried to speak. She shook her head slightly, murmuring something under her breath, but the words didn't come out. She didn't deny it. She didn't fight. And that silence was the loudest confession Nick had ever heard. The room seemed to tilt. The sound of the machines faded into static. All his memories of fatherhood, Noah's first steps, his laughter, the nights spent comforting him after heartbreak, came flooding back, only to twist into something unfamiliar and cruel. Every image shattered under the weight of the doctor's revelation. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and hollow, all at once. The man who had built his entire identity around being a protector, a father, now stood stripped of that certainty. His son, his flesh and blood, was not his. Sharon tried to steady herself, but the guilt was written all over her face. She asked the doctor to stop, to wait, to give them more time before finalizing the results, but the urgency of the situation didn't allow for denial. Noah was dying, and he needed a transfusion immediately. There was no time for emotional reckoning, no space for secrets. The doctor, caught between duty and compassion, reminded them that the mother's sample was still being processed. Sharon nodded weakly, knowing that her blood might be Noah's only hope, even as her heart splintered under the weight of truth. Nick turned away from her, clutching the wall for support. The floor felt like it was giving way beneath him. A lifetime of trust, of forgiveness and reconciliation, seemed meaningless now. His mind reeled through every year of his relationship with Sharon, their love, their betrayals, their reunions. How many times had they told each other that honesty was all that mattered? How many times had he looked into her eyes and believed her? And now, at the worst possible moment, when their son's life hung in the balance, he discovered that the foundation of everything he'd believed was a lie. The test results returned quickly. Sharon was a match. The transfusion began within minutes, her blood flowing through sterile tubing into Noah's fragile veins. She watched as her life force became his, as if trying to will her son back from the brink. Tears streamed down her face, not only for Noah, but for Nick, for the man she had loved, the man she had deceived. Every drop of blood that passed from her body to Noah's carried a confession she could never take back. Nick stood outside the room, holding the lab report in his hands. The paper trembled violently, blurred by tears he couldn't control. The words swam before his eyes, incompatible paternity marker. 3 sterile words that changed everything. His heart pounded with disbelief, anger, sorrow, a symphony of pain so intense it made breathing difficult. He had given his life to this family, sacrificed everything for them, and now he didn't even know who he was in his own son's story. He pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching Sharon through the glass as she lay weak on the hospital bed, her arm connected to the transfusion line. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to storm in and demand answers, when, how, who. But he couldn't. The sight of Noah's motionless body silenced every impulse except love and grief. Regardless of biology, Noah was his son. That was the truth his heart refused to abandon, even when the science screamed otherwise. Outside the hospital, reporters began to gather, drawn by whispers of a Newman family tragedy. Inside, the air grew heavier. Sharon avoided Nick's gaze, her silence becoming its own kind of confession. She didn't need to say the name, it was already there, hovering between them like a ghost. Somewhere in the shadows of their past, another man had left his mark, one decision, one night, one secret that had now erupted into daylight. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, the golden light crept through the blinds, casting long, fractured lines across Noah's bed. His vitals stabilized, but his father's world had fallen apart. Nick sat in the corner of the room, his face buried in his hands, the crumpled lab report lying on the floor beside him. He wasn't just mourning the near loss of his son, he was mourning the death of the truth. The realization that even love, the force that had always kept the Newmans together through every storm, could become a weapon when built on deceit. In the hours that followed, doctors monitored Noah closely. His body responded well to the transfusion, and for the first time since the accident, there was hope. But for Nick, hope had curdled into confusion. He couldn't bring himself to speak to Sharon. Every word that came to mind felt like an accusation. The woman who had once been his anchor was now a stranger. Yet even in his anger, he couldn't ignore the agony etched on her face. He knew she loved Noah, that much was undeniable. But love wasn't the question anymore. Truth was. As the day stretched on, Victor Newman arrived, his expression a mix of concern and suspicion. He had seen enough betrayals in his lifetime to recognize the storm brewing between his son and Sharon. Whatever secret had been unearthed, it was clear that it threatened to tear the family apart. Victor's instinct was immediate: protect the Newman name, control the narrative, and, if necessary, bury the truth. But Nick wasn't thinking about legacy or image. He was thinking about the boy in the bed, the boy who might not share his blood but still held his entire heart. When night fell again, Nick sat alone in the dim light, replaying every moment of his life as a father. The laughter, the arguments, the pride, none of it had been fake. If anything, this revelation proved that love was stronger than DNA. Yet the betrayal lingered, festering like a wound that refused to close. He wondered if Sharon had kept the secret out of shame or protection, and whether she had planned to tell him someday. But those questions didn't matter anymore. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same. In the end, as the monitors hummed and Noah's chest rose with the fragile rhythm of survival, Nick made a silent vow. He would stand by his son, not because of blood, but because of love. He would find out who had done this to Noah, who had caused the crash, and who had turned their lives into chaos. And if Sharon's secret was part of that web, he would face it when the time came. But for now, as tears slipped down his face, all he could whisper to the silence was a truth that had always been his: "You're still my boy." The truth hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. The machines in Noah's hospital room hummed in steady rhythm, each pulse a reminder that life, even at its most fragile, still persisted. Nick stood frozen near the bed, his eyes fixed on the son he had raised but now suddenly could not claim by blood. His world, once built on conviction and devotion, was collapsing from the inside. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and betrayal. Sharon's sobs filled the silence, soft but unrelenting, the sound of a heart that had been hiding its shame for far too long. Nick demanded answers, his voice trembling not with rage but disbelief. The woman who had been his anchor through decades of chaos, the same Sharon he had forgiven through every storm, was now at the center of the most personal betrayal imaginable. Yet when she finally looked at him, tears tracing down her cheeks, her words were barely audible. She told him to calm down, that everything would be explained when Noah recovered. She pleaded that he remember they were still a family, that nothing could erase the years of love, the bond they had built, the sacrifices they had made. "Family isn't only about blood," she whispered, her voice cracking, but the truth in her eyes was too heavy to disguise. But for Nick, love suddenly felt like a cruel disguise for deceit. Every memory he had with Noah, the late-night talks, the laughter, the lessons, was now tainted by doubt. He could still feel pride, still feel love, but underneath it all was a jagged wound that refused to close. Sharon's words of comfort fell like broken glass around him. She asked for patience, but patience could not mend a trust that had been shattered so completely. In her attempt to keep the peace, she had detonated something far worse than an argument. She had ignited a war within his heart. He turned away, his chest tightening with the realization that everything he had once been sure of was gone. How could he stay here, he thought, pretending that nothing had changed? How could he hold the hand of a child that wasn't truly his when every part of him screamed that he had been living a lie? Sharon's cries followed him, begging him not to leave, but he couldn't bear the sight of her. Each glance was another cut. He had built his entire life around being a protector, a father, and now he felt like an imposter standing in a role that had never belonged to him. Nick's thoughts spiraled as he stepped into the cold corridor. The walls seemed to close in, the hospital lights burning too bright, exposing every insecurity he'd ever buried. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the relentless rhythm of disbelief. He wanted to hate Sharon, but the truth was more complicated. He still loved her, perhaps he always would, but that love was now poisoned by doubt. Every act of kindness she had ever shown him now felt rehearsed, every memory suspiciously perfect. The woman who had once felt like home now felt like a stranger wrapped in familiarity. And yet, even as anger churned inside him, guilt shadowed every step. He remembered Noah's childhood, the scraped knees, the first heartbreaks, the milestones they had celebrated together. None of that had been fake. His love had been real. His guidance had been real. The boy in that bed, no matter whose DNA flowed through his veins, was still his son in every way that mattered. But pain has a way of twisting love into resentment, and as Nick stood outside the hospital, staring at the city lights, he felt something dangerous stirring inside him, the desire to walk away. He told himself that maybe it was for the best. That Sharon could handle this without him. That if Noah wasn't his biological son, then perhaps his presence didn't matter anymore. It was a cruel thought, one that betrayed everything he had ever stood for, but in that moment of despair, logic and emotion no longer spoke the same language. He wanted to disappear, to let Sharon live with her choices, to let the truth consume her in his absence. But the question he couldn't escape, the one that clawed at his mind even as he tried to flee, was simple and unbearable. Who was Noah's real father? It wasn't just curiosity, it was torment. Every name from the past flashed through Nick's mind like ghosts from forgotten years. Sharon's history was a long and tangled one, full of heartbreaks, reconciliations, and mistakes. Could it have been someone from before their reconciliation? Someone she had sworn was only a friend? Nick replayed their timeline over and over, searching for gaps, inconsistencies, moments when her eyes had told a story her lips refused to speak. There had been a brief period, years ago, when Sharon had drifted away from him emotionally. She had been fragile, lost after one of their many separations. It was around the same time another man had quietly appeared in her orbit, someone who had offered her comfort when Nick couldn't. That man's name, buried deep in memory, now returned with sharp clarity: Cameron Kirsten. The very thought made Nick's stomach turn. Cameron had been dangerous, obsessive, a man who had nearly destroyed Sharon once before. Could she have hidden something that dark for so long? It seemed impossible, and yet every impossible thing had already happened tonight. But what if it wasn't Cameron? What if it was someone closer, someone who had always been around? Someone who had seen her at her weakest and taken advantage of that moment? Nick's mind drifted to Los Angeles, to the mysterious crash that had nearly killed Noah, and to the name that kept surfacing: Sienna Bacall. Could she somehow be connected to this? Had Sharon been hiding not just a personal betrayal, but something much larger? Something that linked their son to the dangerous world that was now unfolding across two cities? The more Nick thought about it, the more the timelines blurred. Noah's involvement with Sienna, Holden Novak's strange presence, Audra's disappearance, and Victor's investment in Glissade, all of it seemed connected, threads of one enormous web that had begun long before the crash. Sharon's behavior during the blood test made even more sense now. The panic in her eyes hadn't just been fear of losing Noah, it had been the terror of exposure. She knew the secret was buried beneath years of silence, but she had also known that truth always finds a way to surface. And now, in the cruelest of moments, it had. Inside the hospital, Sharon sat beside Noah's bed, her face buried in her hands. Her blood now flowed through his veins, keeping him alive, but her soul felt hollow. She wanted to tell Nick everything, to confess the truth she had kept hidden for so long, but she couldn't, not yet. If she spoke now, the pain would be too much. The truth would destroy them all before Noah even had the chance to open his eyes. She told herself that she would explain when he recovered, that she would take whatever punishment Nick deemed fit. But deep down, she feared that when the moment came, he would be gone for good. In the hallway, Nick stared at the reflection in the glass door, his own face, broken, uncertain, a man stripped of identity. The words Sharon had spoken echoed through his mind: "We're still a family." It sounded beautiful in theory, but it felt like a lie in practice. What kind of family survives when its foundation is deceit? Could love endure without truth, or was it destined to collapse under the weight of betrayal? As dawn crept into the sky, Nick knew he couldn't stay, not yet. He needed air, distance, clarity. He needed to understand what had happened and why. With one final look at his son, he whispered something that only the walls could hear. It wasn't goodbye, but it wasn't a promise to return either. It was the sound of a man trying to decide whether forgiveness was still possible. And somewhere, buried under the layers of secrets that tied Genoa City to Los Angeles, the answer to his question waited in the shadows, a truth darker than he imagined. The identity of Noah's real father wasn't just a private scandal. It was a key to something far larger, a secret that linked Sharon's past mistakes to the storm that had now consumed them all. And when that truth finally surfaced, it would not only redefine Noah's life, it would shatter the Newman family forever.